Our topic today is Minnesota loons and the needs for a freshwater ecosystem. Maddi Nistler is the Education and Outreach Manager at the National Loon Center in Crosslake, Minnesota. Her lifelong love for the outdoors and inner workings of the natural world has led her to become a Minnesota Master Naturalist and an advocate for common loons. Since moving here from Colorado in 2019, Maddi has continued to share her passion for wildlife with others through the Loon Center and beyond. She can often be found off the grid with a fishing rod or talking to trees and local squirrels. Maddi says we're all a little loony for Minnesota's state bird. Whether you only know the common loons by their iconic calls or you're a longtime loon watcher, these charismatic birds will never stop surprising you. In her talk, she will dive into the physical and behavioral characteristics that make common loons unique, the intricate freshwater ecosystems loons call home, and best practices you can adopt to better protect loons from the environmental conflicts they face today. Maddi, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Lynn, for that very nice introduction that you gave. I'm super happy to be here with you today presenting to Tamarack Water Alliance. I know you guys aren't too far down the road from us, and we've had a pretty good relationship with you guys in the past, having volunteers over to Crosslake for our annual Loons and Lakes Festival in June, and just doing your best work to spread the good word of the loons and enjoy the lakes that we are so lucky to have in Minnesota, and doing your best to protect those. So we appreciate that. And with that, I'm going to jump right into loons. I have a lot of content, so if you do have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, as Lynn said. I will probably save them all to the end because I have a lot of slides and I tend to get off topic fairly easy. So I will wait till the end to answer your questions, and they may even be answered in further slides as well. So yeah, with that, my name is Maddi Nistler. I'm the Education Outreach Manager at the National Loon Center. I do want to talk a lot about the Loon Center itself so that you guys are familiar with it. Many of you may be already, since it's so close to Tamarack and the surrounding area. But if you're not familiar, we are a fairly new organization. So I want to talk a little bit about us as an institution. Of course, about the Minnesota state bird. We want to talk a lot about the loon today. But we're also going to talk some about the threats that they are encountering in Minnesota, some of the challenges that are being faced, naturally occurring challenges, and mostly human-caused challenges. And then, of course, talking about what we can do to make sure that human disturbance is not as significant of an impact as it is right now. And then some ways that you can get involved in citizen science and with the Loon Center. This is not a real photo. This is actually just a rendering of what the new building will look like. So the National Loon Center is a nonprofit dedicated to loon and lake freshwater lake resources, education, conservation, research. And we are, as I said, a fairly new organization in terms of wildlife centers in Minnesota. You may be familiar with the National Eagle Center down in Wabasha, with the International Wolf Center in Ely, the North American Bear Center in Ely, and then the International Owl Center in Houston, Minnesota. So we are the newest of the 5 wildlife species in Minnesota. Our wildlife centers in Minnesota. We were founded in 2017 by a group of community members who got together and said, what is something that will bring Crosslake together? What is something that the community can rally around and create community behind? And that is the common loon, the Minnesota state bird. So this building was the original, not the original vision, I guess, of those founders, but it has come a long way since then. And we are so excited to say that yesterday, officially, they broke ground. A couple weeks ago, they were out there putting in the foundation for geothermal. So this is going to be a very green building. Near net zero is our goal. So you'll see kind of in the corner over here, we have some solar panels that will be placed over the parking lot. We have, as I said, geothermal is going to be the main source of heat for the building. And generally, it'll be a very sustainable center. So we're very excited about that, very proud of that. And just generally, it's going to be a really cool center. It's going to be a really cool experience for people to come and learn about loons and love them just as much as we love them. We can't have physical birds in the center like the National Eagle Center does. We won't have any ambassador loons just because loons do not do well in human captivity. They don't do well outside of their natural aquatic habitat. They're very susceptible to disease and they require a lot of space. So unfortunately, we can't have live birds, but we will make up for it with a lot of technology, a lot of very immersive and interactive exhibits. And there's even some games in there that you can play and, you know, pretend that you're a loon. So each floor is going to represent a different stage of a loon's life, a different element of their habitat. So as you walk in on the first floor, it'll be like you are a loon under the water, swimming with the other loons and the fish, diving. And then as you move to the second floor, it'll be like you are a loon on the surface of the water. So when they interact with humans, interact with other loons, interact with other wildlife species that use the lakes, we are also going to have on the third floor some really cool ways to make you feel like you are a loon in flight. So the third and final floor is the ascent into migration, into flight, into the world that we don't see as often because they're in the sky. So it's going to be really cool, really immersive. Should be opening by May of 2027. So the construction will take about a year. We should be finished with the building itself by next November, but then the exhibits on the inside will take about 6 months to put together and test and make sure everything's running smoothly before we open to the public in May. So May of 2027, put that on your calendars. Come visit us in Crosslake. Before then, we have a temporary visitor center in Crosslake Town Square. You can always come talk to us, our volunteers, learn about loons in our small center and buy some loon swag. We have t-shirts, hats, all that kind of stuff too. With that, if you have questions about the Loon Center, feel free to throw those in the chat too. If you want to know about more about our programs, about volunteering or anything like that, feel free to add those. But with that, I'm going to advance to our next topic, which is, I kind of mentioned all this stuff. Oh, here's another photo of the building. I forgot to put this in here. This one's new. So you can see the more, it's kind of a better angle of the solar panels above the parking. The trees, if you've been to Crosslake, we are removing some trees to put the building up, but in the 10-acre plot that we have reserved for the entire campus, we are saving more than 75% of the trees on that campus. A lot of those large, mature pine trees that are there, we're going to save. We're going to make sure there's walking trails and some recreation to be able to enjoy that habitat too. All right, so with that, I'm going to jump right into loons, or dive into loons. So if you are unfamiliar, hopefully you are very familiar as Minnesotans with our state bird. But if you're not, the common loon is the state bird of Minnesota, has been since 1961. In Minnesota, in the United States, we do call the loon because it comes from a Scandinavian word that means clumsy, which tracks. But over in Europe, in Eurasia, they do have populations of loons over there. They call the loon the Great Northern Diver. But the loon is a little less of a mouthful, so we stick with that over here. They are a very, very old lineage of bird. The loon has been, or at least its genetics have been on this planet for about 55, 56 million years, which is pretty substantial for a bird. That is one of, if not the oldest living lineage of birds on the planet. So in the United States, in North America, and in Minnesota, here's what we're looking at as far as population goes. Here is what, let me move your beautiful faces out of the way for a moment so I can see my map. So here is what we are looking at for North America and our population distribution. Here is the range of loons, common loons in North America with that kind of orangish rusty color that you see here in the north. In Minnesota, you can see that kind of dips down just towards the Twin Cities a bit. This map, I think, is exaggerated just a little because it dips down kind of towards almost to the Faribault area. There are no loons down there in the summer that we know of. So this map should be a little bit further north, and hopefully not, but we have started to see that trend continue as the loons are losing a lot of their comfort zone. So already we are at the very bottom of their comfort zone. They like it a little bit colder than it is here, at least now. In the past, it used to be perfect conditions for loons, but that comfort range is starting to move a little bit further north. But in Minnesota, we have 12,000 loons, and that only accounts for 2% of the entire North American population, which is a total of 500,000 common loons, which is quite a lot. Minnesota is actually #2 for the state with the most common loons during the summertime. As you can see from this map, Alaska takes the cake there because they have just sheer land mass and a lot more undisturbed habitat that the loons are very comfortable in. And of course, Canada has a lot of that habitat as well. You'll see the Great Lakes area, particularly Michigan and Wisconsin. They've got quite a bit of healthy loon population as well. The northeastern states, we have the Adirondack Loon Center out in New York. We have the Loon Preservation Committee in New Hampshire. We also have some loons in Maine and Vermont. And we have a couple smaller populations out in the Northwest, and we actually have a small population in Yellowstone. So you can see the distribution there of loons. Our state, however, has the most in the lower 48 states, which is, of course, something to be proud of. This is kind of something that I want to talk about later, but I do want to bring it up now because this is the kind of the seasonality of it is what's happening right now. So we have, at this point in November, most of our loons are gone. We do have some stragglers hanging back. If you see a loon on a lake still, not to worry yet. We don't have ice. Once we start to get ice and there's loons around, then we can start to worry a little bit. But we are just towards the end of migration season right now. So our loons in Minnesota, I wish I had my map with the arrows on it, but I've got my laser pointer, so that'll work. So here in Minnesota, our loons follow the Mississippi Flyway all the way down to the Gulf. They'll hang out there for the entire winter, sometimes making their way around the Florida Panhandle, or I guess around Florida. And they'll hang out down in the ocean actually for the entire winter. So I will dive deeper into this later, but I do want to introduce this as kind of the seasonal happening. I also want to point out that despite what I said about loons typically migrating to the ocean, we do have some large freshwater lakes down in areas like South Carolina. For example, Lake Jocassee has a population of about 150 loons during the winter. So most of the time, the loons are going to saltwater, but there are some freshwater lakes that loons are known to migrate to in winter on. We do send our biologists from the Loon Center down there every year, usually around March, to do some studying about the behaviors of wintering loons, about the relationships and the interactions. We also have this lovely picture from our biologist of a Pacific loon that we spotted in 2023. All the way down in Lake Jocassee, which is amazing because if I go back to this slide, Pacific loons live way up here. They do not live down where our loons live in Minnesota. So on that note, we do have 4 other species of loons. The common loon is obviously the most common. That is the only loon that we have here in Minnesota. You will not see these others typically during the summertime. If these guys are here during the summer, that's very strange because they're not supposed to be here. They like it a lot chillier. They have a little bit more specific needs in their habitat than the common loon does. So they're going to be further up north in Canada and Alaska. And they also exist in parts of Eurasia too. But yeah, we have the red-throated loon, Pacific loon, Arctic loon, and yellow-billed loon. These guys are, as I said, living not in Minnesota, but occasionally we'll see them during migration seasons. We did have a red-throated loon that stopped by couple years ago on his way down to the Gulf, and he hung out with us in Minnesota for a couple of weeks, which was super fun. So occasionally we'll get to see these guys, but not very often. This is my favorite slide. I can't talk about loons without talking about what they sound like. Everybody wants to hear what they sound like, especially now because the loons are not as vocal because there's not as many left. They don't have as many family members to talk to or enemies to talk to for that matter. So I do have all 4 of the calls. We do recognize these 4 as the most common. Sometimes you'll hear something kind of in the middle of these calls, but these are typically what we recognize and know what they mean. So I'm going to go through them, tell you what they mean. You'll get to hear them. If you can't hear them, let me know, but they should work. So this first call, this is called the hoot. This is their very quiet, short distance call. So when they're right next to each other, this is how they communicate. Very cute call, very short, and sweet. That's not one that we hear very often because we're not next to the loons enough to hear that call being made. This next one, though, this is the one that we're probably most familiar with. This is the wail. So the hoot is the short distance call. The wail is the long distance call. So often this is what you hear late at night or early in the morning when the loons separate overnight. Sometimes they will do that to go fish another side of the lake or go fish a different lake. They will also do this in the middle of the day when they need to connect with their other pair member and call them back. Really, they're just saying that I'm alive. I want to make sure you're alive, make sure everything is okay. Hopefully everyone recognizes that one. And then this third one is called the tremolo. You'll probably recognize this one as well. This is the one that kind of sounds like laughter. This is their alarm call. So when there is some threat about, whether it's an eagle flying overhead, maybe a boat's getting too close, this is often what they use to signal to the other loons that there's something making them uncomfortable. You'll also hear this call during flight. So especially during migration, if you are outside and you hear a loon and you're like, I'm nowhere near a lake, what is that sound? If you look overhead, they might be flying overhead because they will use that call as they're flying if they intend to land or if they just want to see the status of a lake. If there's other loons there, they'll use that tremolo to kind of gauge the population of a lake before they land. And then finally, I suppose I should play the tremolo. I explained it, but I didn't play it. That one doesn't get old. I love that one. And then finally, now we have the yodel. So the yodel is really special because only the male loons can make this call. The females, their voice box physically will not allow them to make this call because this is the territorial defense call. This is how the loons establish their territories, ward off other males that want to come take over the territory, take over the breeding ground. This is how they establish their size and how scary they are, how the other males can hear it and decide whether they want to initiate some kind of conflict based on the depth and the pitch of the call. Can sometimes indicate how big a loon is or how old a loon is. So that's a great way for the males to communicate too. Oops. So you can hear in that one, there's there's some other calls in the background. So you can assume there's some kind of conflict happening there where the loons are all talking to each other and chattering. So then going through some seasonal observations, I'll kind of whip through these pretty quick. Since we are not in any of these seasons, we are out of the breeding season, out of nesting season, even out of migration season at this point. But I do want to talk about it pretty quick because as April and May rolls around in the spring, this is some good information to be prepared for, good ways to watch for the loons when they return, if you know when and where they're going to be coming. So April and May is typically when loons are returning. Again, that depends on the ice situation. When ice is melted, oftentimes you'll see, especially like on the St. Croix, on the Mississippi, some of those larger rivers, loons will come up a little bit early and they will stop over on the rivers before ice is fully out up north so that they can continue their journey up to their home lake. So they will typically they'll come to the same nesting spot that they were at the previous summer. If they have a territory that they really like and is well established, the males will return first so that they can get back to that territory and make sure that other males are keeping their distance from it, especially the younger males that don't have a territory yet. They can keep them at a distance. And then the females will come back up and they will reunite with their pair member. I hate to burst a lot of people's bubble with this fact, but the loons technically don't mate for life. They will stay with the same partner for as long as they possibly can if they can consistently have a successful nest, if they have chicks year after year. If the hatch is successful, they will continue to nest with them if they don't lose their pair member. So they could nest for life and mate for life, but that's not always true. So as far as nesting goes, the places that you would often find a loon nesting, so the nesting season actually is May through September. So this is basically the whole summer. We call this whole season the nesting season because typically we don't say that chicks have fledged the nest until they have fledged their home lake, because the chicks actually enter the water within a day of being hatched. So if we say that those chicks have fledged, that doesn't really count because they're still only a day old. So we say they fledge the nest at the end of the summer when they leave to migrate with the adults. So we say May through September is the nesting season. But towards the beginning of the nesting season, this is where you will see the loons there on their quiet little shoreline nests there. They like to build their nest right on the edge of the water so they have easy access in and out. They don't walk on land very well, as I'm sure you know. Their legs are set so far back on their body that they can't walk as well as maybe ducks or geese or other birds with a more balanced center of mass. So they sit right on the surface of the water or right on the edge of the water. And they prefer spaces that are pretty quiet, pretty protected, have a lot of vegetation. One, so they have a material to make their nest out of. You can see, especially in this example here, this loon used the brush and the grasses and the reeds that are around the shoreline to build that little nest bowl. And it keeps the nesting area pretty quiet, pretty covered. A lot of good cover from mammalian predators like raccoons, fox, anything like that that could sneak up behind the loons. You may also see them on little islands, like floating islands of peat moss, sometimes on islands that are a little bit bigger, out in the middle of the lake, kind of like this. If you can see on Crosslake, we have an example of a couple islands that loons tend to nest on because there's less mammalian predators to worry about, less human activity, and less boating activity. They will also choose a spot more often than not with a nice little cove, a little protected bay, again, where there's not a lot of wave action, not a lot of boat activity. They would not choose a nesting spot on an area like the north side of Cross Lake here, this really long, straight part of the lake, because there's a lot of wave activity there. There's no protection from any of the boats or the wake or anything that's coming from the center of the basin of the lake. One thing that I do want to touch on, we do get a lot of questions about artificial nesting platforms or ANPs. This is something that the Minnesota DNR and some other entities have been using to start to augment the loss of nesting habitat because loons require such natural shorelines to build their nests. As you can imagine, we don't have a lot of that to go around in Minnesota. We don't have an unlimited amount of natural shorelines at this point because of human development, because of erosion, because of water level fluctuation. So occasionally the ANPs are a good substitution if there's a lot of predation. If the loons are struggling for some reason to hatch on a shoreline, if they are able to lay the eggs, but maybe they lose them to waves, or maybe the black flies are too significant of a problem, or maybe there's some kind of human disturbance happening, the ANPs can be helpful. There are some guidelines that we want to follow before we plop an ANP right in the middle of a lake, because we don't want to introduce any new competition. We don't want to pull a loon away from their natural nesting site that's been working. So there's some considerations before we recommend that an ANP is implemented. Another thing that we would try to use on a case-by-case basis is nesting signs. We get questions about this a lot too. I have a loon nesting on my lake and there's a lot of boat activity. There's a lot of people really curious about it. I'm going to put up a sign that says there's a loon nesting here, or a sign at the boat launch that says, please be cautious, there's loons on this lake. And that's something the DNR will do often. They'll put a sign up at the boat launch to make sure people know to keep their distance from the loons and be aware of loons on the shoreline. But it's kind of a double-edged sword, because it could be a helpful reminder. It could keep people away from that nest, or it could attract people to the nest. People are really curious if they know that there's a loon nest there. Some people might want to get right up to it, take pictures, stand in the nest, pretend they're a loon, stuff like that. So again, case-by-case basis, definitely seek some guidance before you put out a nesting sign like this. And then as far as the life cycle of a chick, again, as I said, that goes through the entire summer. So starting usually around early June, sometimes early July. I would say the 4th of July is typically the cutoff that we want to see. No chicks hatched after the 4th because then they can't grow to the size and development that they need so that they can leave the nest or leave the lake at the end of the summer. So typically it's 2 eggs per season. Sometimes you'll only get 1 due to some factors that we'll talk about here in just a second. Sometimes, very, very rarely, it'll be 3, but usually it's 2. And you can see the progression over the weeks here. They start riding on mom and dad's back for the first couple of weeks because they're really small and vulnerable and frankly bite-sized. So things like eagles and muskie and northern pike and snapping turtles can make a quick snack out of the chicks. So they keep them safe sitting on mom and dad's back. After a couple of weeks, you can see that the chick fur really is what it is. It's kind of a downy fur when they hatch. That's starting to fall out and they're starting to grow their juvenile feathers. At the end of the summer, typically around 9, 10, 11 weeks is when they start to practice flying. That's when they have their full juvenile plumage. It looks very different from an adult loon. They actually don't get that real adult plumage until they're about 3, 4, 5 years old. So when they migrate at the end of the summer, they leave just like the adults do, but they don't return back up to their natal lake until they're 3, 4, 5 years old because they need time to mature. So if you have chicks on your lake that hatch this summer, unfortunately, you won't see those chicks next summer. You'll have to wait a couple more years for those guys to come back. Couple behaviors that you might see during the summertime. This first one is called the hangover position. This is not a dead loon. This is not a sleeping loon. This loon is feeling threatened. This loon is feeling like I need to make myself small. I need to make it easier for me to escape if I have to. So I'm going to get closer to the water. This is what they do to flatten themselves, to make themselves look less threatening, or to hide from maybe boats or anything getting too close. So if you're on a boat or any kind of watercraft and you're getting too close to a loon, you see them doing this hangover position, that's a good sign to give them a little bit of space because they're feeling a little bit uncomfortable. We don't want to get so close that they leave the nest because that leaves the eggs exposed. This next one is called the penguin dance. You'll see this one typically during loon-on-loon conflict. This is how they make themselves look big and scary. If they do this position in your direction, that's a good sign that you are making them really uncomfortable and you don't want to see what comes next. So give them a little bit of space if you see this penguin dance happening towards you or towards other loons. The foot waggle is a super cute behavior, something that we see pretty often. People mistake it for maybe they have a broken leg or some kind of weird neurological behavior, but this is totally normal. This is something that the loons are doing to thermoregulate. So they're kind of sticking their foot out of the water to get a little bit in between of the air temperature and the water temperature. And then finally, peering. So the loons are visual predators. They look for the food under the water. They kind of stick their head under like they're snorkeling so that they can find fish, so that they can dive under and catch it. Or they're looking for other loons that are swimming underneath so that they can avoid any threats. And then August through September, so once the chicks are mostly grown, or if there's any loons, any adults that did not have a successful hatch, they will be found in the social gatherings or rafts. And this is a pretty common pre-migration behavior. We can have a raft of anywhere from 3, 4, 5 loons all the way up to 150 loons, depending on the size of the lake. So on large lakes where there's a lot of fish, you'll see big groups of loons gathering so that they can fish together. But they can be a little bit more social when there's not a lot to be territorial about at the end of the summer. So this is pretty common behavior. As well as molting. So this loon right here does not have a 5 o'clock shadow. This is very common for the end of the summer. So around September is when they start their pre-molt. So they actually lose all of their summer feathers and they will grow new feathers for the winter. And they kind of look like, they'll look very disheveled for the first couple of months when they're in the middle of losing feathers and growing new feathers. But they lose all of their flight feathers once they get down to wherever they're migrating to when they're wintering. And then they'll reverse that process before they come back up north. So this is kind of fun. This is trying to tell the difference between a juvenile loon that's in its juvenile plumage, brand new feathers, and then an adult loon that is almost towards the end of the molt. You can still see some checker in there. but it's tough to tell the difference between the loons in molt, the adults in molt, and the juveniles that are just getting their juvenile plumage. So the one on the left here, this is the adult loon getting into its winter plumage. You can see the red eye hasn't changed quite yet, but eventually that red eye will change from red to brown, and it'll lose all of its winter checkering or summer checkering that you see here, and it'll turn kind of a brownish, grayish light color. And the juveniles, you can tell they kind of have, these are new feathers. These are brand new that they just grew in, so they don't look quite as messy. And you can see they've got kind of a scalloping on the edge of their feathers, and that's how you can tell the difference pretty easily. So a little bit about diet and hunting, and about some considerations for their habitat, what lakes they're choosing. Loons prefer really cold, clear water lakes, really deep lakes, because of the types of fish that they're going to find on these waters. So the cisco or whitefish or tulipy, whatever you want to call it, that is their key species. That is what they are hunting mostly for in the fall when the lakes turn over and the cisco come a little bit closer to the surface of the water. But generally, they're pretty opportunistic hunters. They will catch whatever they can, whether it's panfish, bass, trout, anything like that. They will feed small minnows or crayfish or leeches to the chicks when they're really small, and then they'll grow to eat some a little bit bigger, like this bass up here. So diving really quickly into the threats that Minnesota loons are experiencing. These are not just limited to Minnesota, and these are not the only threats that we are seeing across North America. This is a fairly short list. I don't have time to talk about all of these. I wish I did. So I'm just going to quickly cover a couple of them, some of the main ones that we are seeing in Minnesota in particular, so that we can address those and pull some more, put some more education out there for those particular threats. So before we get into what those threats are, we want to talk a little bit about what the current population is in Minnesota. So the DNR, the Minnesota DNR has a program called the Loon Restoration Project, and they have a data collection through the Loon Monitoring Program, which is a volunteer program where folks go out every summer and they basically take account of their loons. They say how many adults are on my lake, how many chicks are there, and then they report that data to the DNR. There are some index areas across the state, so this is happening in a lot of places, but these particular index areas are what the DNR is really interested in seeing population-wise, because there's some particular conditions in these counties that they can use to generalize to the rest of the state, and look a little bit closer at some of the things happening regionally that might affect the population. So generally, over the last couple of years, our adult population has been pretty stable. However, they have found a very, very small downtick of about 0.3% in the juvenile population. That's not a very big downtick, but that is something to keep an eye on. We do probably want a good decade of this data to make sure it's actually a trend and not just year-to-year fluctuation. But definitely something to address, something to get out ahead of so that that number doesn't increase. So one thing that we are super concerned about is human disturbance. We have a mortality study with the University of Minnesota where we can recover dead loons and we can do necropsies and we can tell what the cause of death was. More often than not, the cause of death when we recover loons is some kind of trauma, some kind of blunt force trauma from a boat, from a propeller strike, a broken wing, a broken foot, head trauma, something like that because of high-speed watercraft. Not only do you risk hitting the loons on the surface, but there's also a risk to the shorelines with erosion, disturbing the nest, that kind of thing. And then, of course, loss of habitat. We as Minnesotans love our lakes. We love them so much that we sometimes tend to get as close to them as humanly possible because we just want to love them so much. But usually that involves removing natural shorelines, removing habitat for the loons, and removing habitat for the fish that spawn on those shorelines as well. Aquatic invasive species, that is kind of the talk of the town these days because we have things like zebra mussels, starry stonewort, Eurasian water milfoil. Those are the big concerns right now. Throwing these things into the lake, that ecosystem is very, very delicate, and it's very easy to disrupt that ecosystem and that chain of command really in the lake. So zebra mussels, stonewort and Eurasian water milfoil are the biggest ones that we see in this area that really have an impact on infrastructure, on human recreation, human health, wildlife health, and then of course fish and water quality too. As far as water quality goes, we're seeing a real problem with that going along with the shoreline development, because when we develop shorelines, when we put in sandy beaches, when we put in rock riprap along the shoreline to control erosion, often what happens is there's no buffer zone for any runoff that's carrying whether it's phosphorus or nitrates from fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and stuff like that, or if it's road or sidewalk salt, the chloride that comes in the runoff as well. There's nothing there to block that or filter all those pollutants from going straight into the water. And that causes a lot of aesthetic issues. It causes algae blooms. You can get the real nasty stuff like blue-green algae that can be toxic. And the phosphorus growth, or the algae growth from phosphorus is really devastating. And it really not only has an impact on our recreation, but of the loons' use of the water too. Because as I said, they are visual predators. They can't depend on other senses to hunt. They have to be able to see through the water to catch their fish. And if they can't, they're going to leave and find another lake that is clearer and more susceptible to being hunted. Lead fishing tackle, if there's any anglers in the group. I'm also an angler, so this is not to shame anybody, but lead fishing tackle is a huge problem, not just in Minnesota, but across the country, because most fishing tackle these days is still made out of lead because it's cheap, it's malleable, it's easy to get your hands on if you're a manufacturer, and there's just a lack of awareness. People don't often know that their fishing tackle is made out of lead. They don't know the implications of that. So oftentimes when this stuff is dropped into the lakes accidentally, or it gets stuck on fish and the loons ingest it, lead poisoning is more often than not, but almost, I would say 99% of the time, fatal to loons. So about 20 to 25% of all loon deaths in the United States as a whole is caused by lead poisoning, because loons are swallowing it thinking that it's a little pebble that's at the bottom of the lake to store in their gizzard, and they don't know the difference. So it can look a lot of different ways. If you're not familiar with what lead might look like in your tackle box, it can be like a little sinker or a jig that has paint on it. Just because there's paint on it doesn't mean it's not still toxic. That paint can come off, and when it's in a gizzard with the digestive juices in there, it's just as toxic. Sometimes you get really weird shaped lead. Maybe you don't know that it's lead. Maybe you get little tiny lead sinkers like this. The way that you can know for sure is if you take that lead and you draw on a piece of paper and it looks like you just wrote with like a mechanical pencil, that means it's probably lead. So that's a good way to tell. Or if you take a pliers and you squeeze it and it leaves a little imprint because it's really squishy, it's really malleable metal, that's another good way to know too. I'm going to skip this for now because it's 10:45 and I want to give you guys time for questions. But this is just a hard way to find the lead, even if you're a human with human eyes looking at a still picture that's not at the bottom of the water. Imagine you're a loon trying to find all this lead at the bottom of the lake, and not even knowing that lead exists, trying to find the difference. It's pretty tough. So I do want to talk about, because you guys are very prominent advocates for freshwater contaminants from heavy metals and pollution in regards to mining. So I do want to talk about that, how that kind of has an impact on our loons in Minnesota and in this area, especially around Tamarack in particular. I'm sure, as you know, this is not a new fact that the Iron Range and especially eastern Minnesota has a lot of the mining industry in its in those regions. So taconite, copper, nickel, manganese, these are all very common things that are found in Minnesota and are very desirable things that a lot of mining companies are going after these days. But what happens when mining, kind of like what's happening in this is a pretty drastic example, but when those sulfide minerals like copper, nickel, manganese are exposed to air and water, they create sulfuric acid. And that acid, I'm sure you guys know this, but that leaches the heavy metals that drain into waterways and end up in our lakes and end up eventually going up the food chain, up the trophic levels to our loons, to humans, to our game fish. So when that sulfate from the mining waste ends up in the waterways, that can stimulate the bacteria that converts that naturally occurring mercury, because there's lots of naturally occurring mercury in our lakes already, but that bacteria that activates it creates methylmercury, and the methylmercury is what is toxic to fish, humans, birds, all wildlife. So I can kind of show you how that happens with bioaccumulation, biomagnification. So as the mercury travels up the trophic levels, the bigger the animal is, the more that animal has to consume to be able to survive. So the more mercury they are consuming because they're eating more than the smaller animals beneath them, if that makes sense. So in lake ecosystems, it starts with that little bacteria that activates the mercury, and then you get the algae that has the mercury in it as well. And then you get the little fish that eat the bacteria and eat the algae, and then you get the bigger fish that eat the little fish, and then the big game fish like walleye and northern pike that eat those smaller fish, and then you get loons, humans that are eating the big game fish. And there was not in Minnesota, but there's a study done over in the Adirondacks in New York, and they found out that there is a fairly strong correlation that between large fish and their mercury concentrations and the mercury concentrations in loons. And I can show you a little bit about some of the implications of that, what that looks like in loons, because it can present itself in different ways, depending on how serious the mercury poisoning is, depending on how far along the poisoning has advanced in the loon. So some things that you may notice if a loon is acting a little bit abnormal, some things maybe you can see just behaviorally, but there are a lot of things that will show up in a toxicology report that we may not be able to see. So a lot of that could be incubation periods when they're sitting on the nest and protecting the eggs. That could be decreased just because the loons get they get a little antsier and they don't want to sit on the nest. They don't have as much of a motivation to hunt. They don't have as much strength or motor control as they should. They don't have the ability to thermoregulate like they should. And then as they're growing, if the chicks have mercury poisoning passed on from the adults, or if they just absorb it just generally through the same methods that the adults are getting it, their feathers can come in asymmetrically, they can be underdeveloped, their bone structure and again their motor control can be underdeveloped. In serious cases, if the poisoning is pretty far along, we can see reproductive issues with the females. That's when sometimes you'll get only one egg laid because there's some, it could be just because the female is a little bit younger, she doesn't have the experience yet, but it could be because mercury is preventing the second egg from forming. And then thin egg tissues, so the eggs, similar with eagles when they found that with like, when DEET was an issue, they found that thin egg tissues were leading to a loss of population because the eggs weren't hatching. They weren't making it to the full gestation period. So how's that affecting our population of loons in Minnesota? So again, based on that loon monitoring program through the Minnesota DNR in 2024, so not this previous summer, but the summer before, they found through the volunteer data that they collected, again, the adult population was stable. The juvenile population had a very slight decline, but these are the index areas that they were looking at. And in those index areas, in particular, Itasca County, this area in Itasca County, and the area in Cook and Lake counties had an average number of both the adults and the juveniles per 100 acres decrease. So not just the juveniles, but also the adults in that area. They also found that in Cook and Lake County, the reproductive success was lowest out of all those index areas too. But we don't have any data for St. Louis County because they use Itasca and Cook and Lake to kind of generalize to St. Louis. But we can, just by this data that we see here, we can probably generalize that St. Louis is having the same kind of reproductive success issues as Cook and Lake and Itasca County. We don't know too much about what's happening down here in Carlton and Pine counties, again, because they're probably generalizing from Aiken and Crow Wing. Aiken and Crowing are actually doing fairly well. We don't have as much of an issue with mining down in Aiken and Crowing counties yet, not as much as on the Iron Range, for example. So we don't see that issue presenting itself at this point, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. We don't know what the future will be, but for now, Aiken and Crowing are fairly stable populations. So really quick, this was a lot of doom and gloom, and I don't like to end on doom and gloom. I like to end on what can we do, what can individuals, organizations like Tamarack Water Alliance, lake associations, what can you guys do to get involved? How can we do our part? So we have a program at the Loon Center called Share a Shoreline. It's basically it's 5 things, 5 action items that you can adopt in your everyday life and recreation, and your landscaping techniques that will help contribute to healthy loon populations and healthy lakes. So 1, watching your wake, being mindful of where the loons are in the water, where the loons are on the shorelines, being careful about where you're driving your boat at high speeds, and being aware of no wake signs. Number 2, this kind of goes along with watch your wake, give wildlife space. At least 200 feet is typically ideal. We want to make sure that loons have enough space to go about their day, make sure they don't get overstressed because of boat activity. Use binoculars, use your camera, you do what you got to do to give them that space that they need. Fishing loon safe, I'll talk about that in a moment, but switching from lead tackle to a non-lead tackle. And then cleaning, draining, and drying, so preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species. I'll talk about that in a second as well. And landscaping for loons. So this is basically supporting and creating natural loon-friendly shorelines and habitats. And that doesn't have to be a whole shoreline restoration project. It can be something as simple as having 5 or 10 feet on your property, on your shoreline, that you just let nature take over, let nature do its thing. Plant some native vegetation, if you've got a fallen tree, leave that fallen tree on the shore. That provides habitat for turtles and fish and frogs and insects. Use a no-mow zone, so leave that couple of feet on your shoreline without mowing it. Just let nature take over, let it do its thing. That'll keep invasives out as well. And reducing fertilizer use, keeping your septic maintained, avoiding sand beaches if possible. If you have more questions about landscaping for loons, I know it's not landscaping season at all, but if you are thinking about the spring and you want to get involved in some kind of shoreline restoration, you can definitely reach out to me and I can provide some resources to get started on that. I kind of talked about this stuff. Talked about this as well, but again, just making sure you're keeping a good distance from the loons when you're on any kind of watercraft, if it's motorized or not. Said that stuff already. Keeping 200 feet is ideal. If you are removing your boats and your boat lifts or any water equipment for the summer, for the summer and storing it for the winter, making sure that you are cleaning, draining, and drying that equipment. If you don't have a decontamination station near you, use your resources like the DNR, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, lake associations. They'll tell you where the decon units are. If you don't have a decon unit around you that's open or close enough, even if you use like a car wash, if you use high pressure water in a car wash, that is enough to remove the plant and zebra mussel matter off of your watercraft. And then just educating your neighbors. If you see your neighbors that take their boat out of the water and then put it back in a different body of water the next day, make sure you say something, because they may not know. They may not know that they are transferring plant matter and invasive species from one body of water to another. Fishing loon safe. Again, as I said, there's resources online for non-lead tackle. If you are interested in any of those, you can find a lot of retailers on this QR code here through the Get the Lead Out program, through the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. They have a lot of resources for great manufacturers that are creating non-lead alternatives. And you can also drop off your old lead tackle, so you can remove lead tackle from your tackle boxes and drop them off safely and recycle them at your county household hazardous waste, or you can take it to the Loon Center or some other. I think the Get the Lead Out program has a list of drop-off sites that you can take your old lead to, and they'll recycle that properly for you. Community science, again, the DNR has the Loon Watcher survey, so you can go out and record some phenology and record throughout the summer how your loons are doing, because the DNR appreciates that data just as much as the data from the loon monitoring program so that they can get more population census from volunteers across the state. There's also the migration study that we partner with the US Geological Survey to complete. Basically, we're just tracking where the loons are going during migration, which is super cool to see with the banding process and everything, and where the loons are going, how fast they're going, how many hours and miles they're traveling in one day. So that's a pretty cool study to check out. eBird and iNaturalist are really great for tracking migration as just a citizen science activity. You can submit your photo observations, you can submit any wintering reports, and then iNaturalist is great because you can submit mortalities. So if you come across a dead loon, you can check the box that says mortality, and that helps us track that kind of thing as well. And then finally, I do want to talk about the Bird Genoscape project. We do have on our YouTube channel, National Loon Center YouTube, you can watch a little video about, it's basically ancestry.com for birds. So they're taking the genes and the DNA from feathers, and they're doing like a genetic tracking through the decades, through the centuries that loons have been around, and you can see loons from Minnesota, how they're related to loons in the Midwest, to Canada, to all across the country and the continent, which is super cool. Whew. Talked really fast there at the end, but I do want to open up for questions. I see that there are some in the chat. I'll put up this slide as well. If you guys want to get involved with volunteering, with, you know, if you want to donate, we do have a lot of, because the building is coming up pretty soon, we do have a lot of opportunities for donations to leave your legacy on the Loon Center. If you want to do like a paver or a brick, if you want to have your name up on the donor wall, if you want to have your name on an exhibit, that's a great way to leave your legacy on something that you care a lot about. So yeah, feel free to visit us online, visit us on social media. We have a newsletter, or you can come visit us in Crosslake at our temporary spot in Town Square. So I will, I'll stop talking now, and I'll let you guys ask any questions that you want to ask with the couple minutes that we have left here.
Well, the first question is, do you have any plans to incorporate Project Loon Watch from Northland College?
Ooh, that's a good question. I know we do have a lot of local universities and colleges that we're very supportive of those kinds of programs, and we do have, even in like Wisconsin and Michigan, we do have some other loon watcher programs, all volunteer based, that we love to hear about. I think I guess I don't specifically know what the future research capacity of the Loon Center will look like, because we are such a small operation now. We don't have a whole lot of research coming out of the Loon Center. We will once the new center is up, but for now, I think we are pretty comfortable with using the data that the DNR is providing. So there may be an opportunity for that college to collaborate with the DNR and their Loon Watcher studies too. That's a good question.
Here's another one. You said that loons don't do well in captivity. Does that mean that their population can't be supported by breeding programs? Even more reason to protect our lakes.
Yes, that is correct. We don't have any captive breeding programs of loons. You won't find them in the Minnesota Zoo. You won't find them in any zoo, hopefully, because they're susceptible to like a fungal lung disease when they're in captivity. They have to be in open space. They have to be in the environment that they've been thriving in for millions of years. So unfortunately, no, we can't have any loons in captivity for breeding purposes. And you're right, that is all the more reason to keep our loon population stable in Minnesota, for sure.
Okay. And then the same person said, I heard vocalizations between a family with a baby this summer that I had never heard before, almost like a sigh or a hum. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely not uncommon for, especially during early nesting season when the chicks are really young. It's not uncommon for some vocalizations that are less than normal, less than what you would normally hear out of those four that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, I would say we probably don't necessarily know what they're trying to say with those vocalizations, just because when they're in the in-between stage, it could be, well, it could be a mix of this and it could be a mix of this. Typically, if it's something a little bit softer, a little bit quieter like that, they're probably just speaking. They're just communicating with the chicks.
That was me.
Sometimes the chicks make a little bit different sound too.
That was
me. Sorry, Anna, go ahead.
It was like a
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and
yeah, I would say that probably sounds like something that they would use to communicate with the chicks, something a little bit softer and quieter.
Yeah, and then the baby went and hid under the neighbor's dock.
Yeah, they'll do that. So when there's an eagle or something around, they will let the chick know that they need to be stashed. So they'll stash the chicks so that they can deal with whatever the threat is, and then they'll go back and get them. That's a great question.
Do you have results from increased thinning and unhatched eggs and what it's caused by?
That is something that is not as thoroughly explored in loons yet. I know over in the Northeast, they are doing a little bit more work on that. In Minnesota, I don't think we have any studies on the impacts of mercury in nesting yet. Again, that could be coming with the new center. There's just not, believe it or not, with the loon being the state bird here, we don't have as many people in this state working on that kind of thing. So we don't know a lot yet about the other implications of mercury on reproductive success. The biggest one that we can kind of identify and pinpoint is the thinning of the egg tissues, just because the mercury eats at those tissues and it prevents the female from fully developing the egg before it's laid. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but that's what I think people kind of come to the conclusion. Those biologists out in the Adirondacks, they are working very diligently to address this new threat, because this isn't something that we have really talked about as much as other threats, but it's definitely a newly emerged issue that we're trying to address.
Two more quick questions. How many ANPs can a lake support, and what is the lake size versus an ANP ratio?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically we try to, it depends on every lake, because for the most part, when loons are nesting naturally, they can have a territory anywhere between 60 acres to 120 acres. And that depends a lot on the profile of a lake. If you have a lake that's really small and round, maybe you only get one loon on that lake, or one pair. If you have a lake like Crosslake that has a lot of interesting profile like pieces in it, like there's little bays, there's islands, there's little parts here and there that go in and out, inlets and outlets, and maybe a river mouth, anything like that. An interesting shaped lake is going to be able to hold more loons just because of the amount of available shoreline. It also depends a lot on how many fish are in the lake. If there's a lot of food available, they can sustain a little bit more. That lake can sustain more loons than a lake that doesn't have as high of a population of food.
And then oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Lynn. I was just going to say, so with the ANPs, we want to make sure that we're not plopping a nest down right in the middle of two territories, because then you're going to add competition to that, those two established pairs that isn't necessary. Just because we want a pair of loons there doesn't mean the lake can hold that many loons, if that makes sense.
We're going to need to stop. It was a wonderful presentation, so very informative, rich, full of a lot of information. I know when I see loons on my lake, I'll remember a lot of what you've said.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm sorry I talked for so long. If you have extra questions, you can always screenshot my email there. Or Lynn, if you have my email, you can pass it on to whoever, and I can. Yes. I'm happy to answer any other questions.